Wrigley Field was once the place where the name Sammy Sosa was chanted like a prayer, where every swing of his bat made the entire city hold its breath and then erupt, where the summers of the late 1990s were etched into American baseball history with power, a smile, and the Dominican Republic flag waving in a sea of people. He is one of the very few players in MLB history to hit more than 600 home runs, the only one to have 3 seasons surpassing 60 home runs, the symbol of the 1998 home run race that pulled all of baseball out of the gloom following the strike. With the Chicago Cubs, Sammy was not just a star. He was the soul of Wrigley Field in its finest days, the player who brought hope, revenue, fans, and the belief that baseball could still move America. The All-Star selections, the MVP award, the record-breaking seasons, the nationally televised nights, the kids mimicking his stance in front of mirrors. All of it once created an image that seemed unshakable. Sammy Sosa, living legend, the man who reached the pinnacle that millions of kids dream of. But behind those numbers and cheers, another life quietly existed. A life he had to keep hidden in order to keep standing. When the lights gradually dimmed and the cheers turned to silence, Sammy began living in 2 parallel worlds. One, Sammy of public memory, controversial, frozen in questions that never received complete answers, and a very real Sammy, carrying the fear from a childhood of poverty, the obsession with never being allowed to show weakness, and the determination to protect his family and himself from the storm of judgment. He learned to stay silent, learned to endure, learned to survive when history no longer called his name. Because for Sammy, survival was sometimes not a glorious victory, but being strong enough to keep walking when the world only remembers half of who you are. The most painful part is not being accused, but having to carry both the glory and the wounds in the same body, to keep living, to keep standing. When one part of your life has been erased from collective memory and the rest has to hold strong so it doesn't collapse. If you want to keep following the story behind the spotlight of sports legends, please hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part, where the real life of Sammy Sosa begins to be revealed. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next part, where we dive deeper into the years that forced him to live 2 parallel lives. Sammy Sosa was born in San Pedro de Macorís, a place where poverty was not a temporary condition, but a permanent state, where dusty streets and cramped houses taught children lessons in scarcity before they even understood what dreams were. There, violence did not always take the form of guns, but showed up in prolonged hunger, in evenings without enough light, in the arguments of exhausted adults who did not know where tomorrow's money would come from. Sammy's family was large, crowded, and fragile, just like the land they lived on. Every meal was a calculation, every passing day a challenge, and childhood was not measured in games but in endurance. Sammy's father died when he was very young, a death that came earlier than the family was mentally prepared for, leaving a void not only emotional but also about survival. The breadwinner disappeared, and with him went the rare sense of security the family had ever known. From that moment, Sammy's world changed forever, because the boy understood very quickly, in the way only poor children do, that no one was coming to save him, that pity did not feed anyone, and that if he did not stand up on his own, he would be swept away, like so many other nameless fates. Sammy threw himself into work when he was far too young for it to be called a choice. Shining shoes on scorching streets, selling goods as a street vendor under the harsh Caribbean sun, chasing every loose coin with skinny legs and eyes, always tense with fear of being left behind. Other kids could daydream, but Sammy learned to observe, learned to read adults' moods, learned to know when to bow his head and when to quickly walk away, because the smallest mistake could cost a missed dinner. In that poor house, he grew up with a quiet but persistent fear of becoming useless, fear that one day he would no longer be able to help his family, fear of being seen as just another mouth to feed without bringing any value. That fear did not need to be taught. It formed on its own from his mother's worried looks, from the heavy silence when money ran low, from the helplessness of a child seeing that even adults had no answers. Baseball entered Sammy's life not as a pastime, but as a fragile promise, a luxury possibility that there might be another path where strength and hard work could be traded for opportunity. But even holding a bat, Sammy was not allowed to be naive. Every time he played was a reminder to himself that this was not a dream. This was a chance to escape poverty, and if he failed, he would return exactly to where he started, with empty hands and a future sealed shut. In the exhausted evenings after work, Sammy had no space to feel sad or sorry for himself, because sadness was a luxury too. He learned to swallow it inside, just as later he learned to swallow pain, fear, and questions without answers. Sammy's childhood had no moments that were truly safe, only short pauses between waves of anxiety. And that was exactly what forged a will so tough it was ruthless toward himself. He had to be strong, had to move forward, had to prove his worth. Looking back, one can see that in the skinny boy from San Pedro de Macorís already existed the seeds of two parallel lives, a child carrying constant fear inside, and a person gradually learning to put on an armor of strength to survive. That is the root of the tragedy. Not a loud event, but a long chain of days where Sammy was forced to grow up too soon, carrying the obsession that if he slowed down, if he weakened, he would become the useless person he always feared, and there would be no place left for him in a world that had never shown kindness. As he entered his teenage years, when many other kids were still allowed to daydream about the future, for Sammy Sosa, baseball was never a romantic dream. It was the fragile boundary between living and starving, between being able to keep existing or falling back into the inescapable loop of poverty. Every time he held the bat, every time he ran on the cracked dirt fields in San Pedro de Macorís, Sammy did not think about cheers or fame, but about dinner, about whether the family would have enough money tomorrow. Baseball became the only thing capable of trading for a real chance, and when that chance appeared, it came in a cold way, allowing no hesitation. Sammy left the Dominican Republic when he was very young, carrying a small bag, a few old sets of clothes, and the weight of expectations he was not yet old enough to fully understand. The moment of parting with his family had no loud tears, only hurried hugs, and a fear compressed tightly in his chest. Fear that if he failed, he would not only lose his own future, but also betray the fragile hope of those left behind. In a foreign country, Sammy faced loneliness in its rawest form, unfamiliar language, alien culture, and the feeling of being shrunk down among people who seemed better prepared for this world. He had no voice, no right to complain, no place to be weak, because every mistake could be remembered. Every moment of slowing down could leave him behind. The long training sessions, the body pains that had no time to heal, the nights lying alone under unfamiliar ceilings, all taught Sammy a ruthless but necessary lesson. To survive, he had to be stronger than others, not just physically, but in enduring and staying silent. That strength did not come from joy, but from fear. Fear of being cut, fear of being seen as not good enough, fear of returning empty-handed with the disappointed eyes of his family. Sammy learned to hide his homesickness, learned not to ask why, learned to turn himself into a tireless working machine, because in this world, emotions brought no advantage. He began building his first self, a self based on toughness, perseverance, and a determination not to let himself collapse in front of anyone. Every successful hit was not just a step forward in his young career, but a reminder that the path he was on was right, that pain and loneliness could be exchanged for hope. But at the same time, every missed swing, every poor performance day reignited the old obsession, the feeling of uselessness lurking, waiting for him to slip. No one told Sammy that leaving family and childhood would leave such deep cracks. No one prepared him to understand that strength built from fear would follow him for life. In those early years, Sammy did not just learn how to play baseball. He learned how to survive in a system with no room for slowness, where every person could be replaced. And right there, among nameless training fields and exhausting long trips, a parallel life gradually took shape. On the outside, a young player growing stronger, full of potential. On the inside, a child still trembling before the fear of poverty and failure. Baseball gave Sammy a path, but it also forced him to pay the price with loneliness, with losing the right to be weak, and with a silent promise to himself that no matter what he had to do, he would never go back to being the useless person he feared most. The America that Sammy Sosa stepped into was not like the vague dream people told about back home, where hard work alone would be enough to be welcomed. It was a cold, vast, and distant space, where he quickly realized he was just an outsider who had to find his own place. The early years in America passed in a constant feeling of displacement, when everything around him operated in a language Sammy had not yet mastered, not just English, but the invisible language of glances, of prejudice, and of silent judgment. In the locker room, on the practice field, he heard people talk about him as a muscular Latin player, a useful body, more than a person who needed to be listened to, a resource to be exploited, rather than an individual with his own story. No one asked Sammy where he came from, what he had been through, or why he carried a constant tension in his eyes. What they cared about was how far he could hit the ball, how fast he could run, and whether he could produce value right now. The seemingly harmless comments, the passing glances, the compliments tinged with comparison, all piled up into a quiet pressure that forced Sammy to understand that to survive, he was not allowed to be sensitive, not allowed to slow down, and certainly not allowed to show vulnerability. The language barrier made it hard for him to express his thoughts, and that very silence was interpreted as aloofness, even unfriendliness, when in reality it was just a young man trying not to reveal his fear. Sammy began learning a new lesson, more subtle than anything he had learned on the streets of San Pedro de Macorís. Here, strength lay not only in muscles, but in the ability to conceal. He practiced smiling more than his true feelings allowed, practiced appearing relaxed even when full of unease inside, practiced turning showmanship into armor, because he understood that in an environment where everyone was watching to judge, any sign of weakness could be exploited. Sammy's smile gradually became a reflex, a way to ease the atmosphere, to make others accept him more easily. But behind that smile was a mind always on guard, always asking himself if he was doing well enough. In the evenings after practice, when he returned to his small room, the loneliness flooded back. No family, no mother's voice, no familiar smell of food, only silence and nameless thoughts. Sammy missed home, but did not allow himself to say it, because homesickness could also be seen as weakness. He missed his own language, but had to learn to pronounce words as close as possible to those around him, so as not to be considered out of place. In that process, a second life gradually formed, parallel to the real self he kept hidden. On the outside, a confident Sammy, full of energy, ready to draw attention with power and showmanship. On the inside, a young man learning to survive in a society that had never truly opened its arms to welcome him. The double life took root in very small moments, in the way he chose silence over explanation, chose to smile instead of admitting he was afraid, chose to become bigger on the field, to hide the smallness he felt inside. America did not feel like home, but it was the only place where Sammy could continue on the path he had chosen. And so, he had to adapt, had to turn himself into the version this world would most easily accept. With each passing day, that adaptation brought Sammy more opportunities, but it also took away a part of his true self, leaving a growing gap between the image the public saw and the person living in silence. It was in that gap that the seed of tragedy was planted, not by one big event, but by hundreds of small choices, where Sammy chose to survive rather than to be himself, and learned to live two lives at once from a very young age. Chicago came to Sammy Sosa like a promise that was both dazzling and frightening, because from the moment he put on the Cubs uniform, he understood that he was not just joining a team, but stepping into a city that was always hungry for heroes. Wrigley Field was unlike anywhere Sammy had ever known. Ancient, noisy, full of emotion, where history weighed heavily on every seat, and each season carried expectations far beyond what one person could bear. In his early years in Chicago, Sammy began to taste success. The first hits that made the crowd leap to their feet, the waves of applause rolling through the stadium, and in those moments, he felt something close to being accepted. Initial success came faster than anything Sammy had ever dared dream, and with it came the feeling that he finally had value, that the years of poverty, loneliness, and endurance had not been meaningless. But very soon, amid the evenings of adoration and the praising articles, Sammy realized that this city's love was not unconditional. It came with numbers, statistics, expectations that had to be met again and again. As long as he kept winning, as long as he kept hitting the ball far, as long as he kept bringing joy and hope, Chicago would love him, would call his name as part of itself. But beneath that warmth was a cold truth. If his performance dipped even slightly, if the numbers dropped, that love could change its tone very quickly. Sammy began living in a constant state of being measured not by who he was as a person, but by what he produced on the scoreboard. Every good game was affirmation that he deserved to be here, every bad game a reminder that his place was never guaranteed. The applause became something that both nourished and threatened, because Sammy understood it could disappear as quickly as it appeared. In the locker room, amid words of encouragement and expectant looks, he learned to hide his fatigue, to hide the worry that one day he would no longer be strong enough to meet what was demanded of him. Success turned Sammy into a hero, but it also forced him to maintain that image at any cost, because in this world, heroes were not allowed to be tired, not allowed to slow down, and certainly not allowed to be weak. Gradually, Sammy began to understand that his value was tied tightly to numbers, that he was seen as an addition or subtraction on the stat sheet more than a human being with limits. With each passing season, the pressure did not ease. It grew, because early success created a standard he was forced to repeat, even surpass. The city did not ask Sammy how he felt, did not ask what he carried from his past. They only asked how much more he could give. And Sammy, carrying the fear from his impoverished childhood, never dared to answer that he was tired, that he needed to stop, because he knew the price of no longer being needed. He learned to smile for the cameras, learned to show exuberant joy and victory, while inside, he was a man constantly telling himself that if he slowed down even one beat, everything could collapse. The double life began to become clearer in Chicago. On the outside, the Sammy Sosa of Wrigley Field, the beloved hero, the symbol of hope and strength. On the inside, the Sammy Sosa of long, sleepless nights, of constant worry, that this love only existed as long as he kept winning. He did not resent the city, because Chicago never hid it. They loved those who brought victories, and Sammy understood the rules of this game from very early on. But that understanding did not make the pain lighter. It only made him grow accustomed to living in a state of constant proving. Every swing of the bat was no longer just a play. It was a test of his place in the hearts of tens of thousands of people. And while Chicago loved the hero, Sammy began to feel deeply that his real self still stood on the sidelines, quietly watching, accepting that role as an inevitable part of the path he had chosen. He knew he was getting closer to the pinnacle, but at the same time moving deeper into an invisible cage, where love was given conditionally and where he himself was gradually defined not by what he had overcome, but by what he could continue to deliver. The summer of 1998 arrived in Chicago like a fever, spreading across America. And at the center of that fever was Sammy Sosa, the man who just a few years earlier still had to prove he deserved to stand on the Wrigley Field grass. After the strike that nearly stripped American baseball of its soul, the stands had been empty, fans' faith eroded, and the entire league entered 1998 with a quiet fear that the sport once called America's game might never regain its old glory. And then the home runs started coming, not scattered, but relentless, fierce, as if the ball itself carried a desperation to be noticed again. The home run race between Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire quickly grew beyond sports, becoming a cultural event, a story the whole country followed every night, where rising numbers represented not just individual achievements, but the revival of a dying league. Sammy entered that season carrying everything from his past: the fear of failure, the hunger for recognition, and the will that refused to let him slow down even for a beat. Every successful swing brought roars that lifted the entire stadium to its feet, every ball sailing over the fence, an affirmation that baseball still had the power to make people believe. The media called him a national symbol, the Latin hero, who gave America a summer everyone needed, a summer where arguments and disappointments were temporarily replaced by the pure joy of sport. Sammy was not just playing baseball. He carried on his shoulders the hopes of MLB, of fans who wanted to believe they could love this sport again without dwelling on the broken past. But while the country celebrated every number, few saw the price Sammy was paying. His body was pushed to the point where the line between effort and exhaustion disappeared. Pain became a familiar companion, mornings waking up with tight muscles and fatigue treated as normal. Sammy did not allow himself rest, because every day off could shift the race, and more importantly, could make public attention drift away. His mind was locked in a single state: keep going, keep the pace, surpass yesterday's self. The pinnacle he reached in 1998 did not bring a sense of release. It felt like a door slamming shut behind him, turning into an invisible prison where he was trapped by what he had created. Sammy became a symbol, but he also lost the right to be an ordinary person. Every move was scrutinized, every moment of hesitation questioned. When he raised his homeland's flag after each home run, it was not just personal pride, but a message of existence, proof that a poor boy from San Pedro de Macorís stood at the center of America's biggest stage. But that pride came with crushing pressure. From now on, he was no longer allowed to dip, no longer allowed to return to being a regular player, because symbols are not permitted to be ordinary. Every game became a required performance, every swing a promise to keep, and Sammy, with all the fear ingrained from childhood, never dared to break that promise. The media called that summer a miracle, but for Sammy, it was the beginning of a life completely defined by expectation. When the season ended and the numbers were etched into history, he was hailed as the man who saved American baseball, who gave the country a reason to return to the ballparks. But in the rare moments without cameras, when the cheers died down, Sammy began to feel a nameless emptiness, because he understood that, from here on, nothing would ever be the same again. The pinnacle had become the new standard, and that standard allowed no pause for breath. 1998 was not just a great season. It was the central event of Sammy Sosa's life, where he achieved everything people dream of, but at the same time lost the ability to slow down, to make mistakes, to be weak. Baseball was saved, the stands filled again, faith restored. But somewhere a human being began to be imprisoned, in the very image the world demanded he maintain. And from that moment, Sammy's road ahead was no longer a journey upward, but an endless flight from the collapse he knew would come sooner or later if he was no longer strong enough to keep that miracle alive. After the summer of 1998, when the cheers still echoed in the collective memory, Sammy Sosa entered the years when he was never allowed to fail because expectations did not ease, but swelled like a shadow weighing heavily on every step. Each new season no longer began as an opportunity, but as a survival test, where he had to prove that the miracle of the previous year was not an accident, that he still deserved the symbolic status America had bestowed upon him. The numbers were no longer just achievements. They became an unspoken moral standard. If he did not reach them, questions would immediately arise, followed by doubt, disappointment, and turning away. Sammy understood this all too well, because he had grown up in a world where a person's value was always tied to their ability to provide benefits. So he no longer played baseball out of love, like in the early days. The pure joy had been replaced by a deep-seated fear that if he slowed down, if he weakened, he would be replaced as quickly as so many other faces had been. Every practice session became harsher. Every game added another layer of invisible pressure, and his body began showing signs of fatigue that he deliberately ignored, because stopping meant admitting limits. Sosa did not allow himself rest, did not allow himself to say he was exhausted, because in the role of a symbol, fatigue was also a form of failure. The public continued to see in him strength, explosiveness, the familiar smile after every long hit, but few noticed that behind that image was a man gradually draining away. The double life was no longer emerging. It existed clearly like two different heartbeats in the same body. One, Sammy Sosa of the stage, where he had to be strong, confident, always ready to meet expectations, and one, Sammy Sosa of the inner self, where fatigue built up day by day, where the fear of being replaced always lurked like a warning that never turned off. In the evenings returning after games, when the lights went out and the cheers were gone, he faced the heavy silence of himself, wondering if tomorrow he would still have the strength to continue. But that question was rarely allowed to linger, because the next morning he had to step onto the field again, prove himself again, fight again against the shadow of 1998. Sosa began to feel that he no longer controlled the rhythm of his own life. Everything revolved around the schedule, statistics, and newspaper headlines waiting to praise or tear down. He played not out of love for baseball, but out of fear of being removed from the story, pushed to the sidelines like a miracle past its expiration date. In that world, exhaustion was not recognized as a human reality, but as a sign of unacceptable weakness. And so, Sammy kept pushing himself, kept swinging the bat with whatever strength remained, kept building the strong image to cover the deepening cracks inside. The years after 1998 had no explosion quite like it, but they carried a different kind of tension, smoldering and prolonged, where each season was a race against time and against his own body. Sosa understood he was paying the price for what he had achieved, but he saw no other choice. Turning back was impossible. Stopping was not permitted. And while the public continued to demand long hits, impressive numbers, his inner self grew further from the original joy, replaced by a tough but weary will just enough to keep existing. This was the period when Sammy Sosa lived most fully in his two parallel lives, one life praised for its strength, and one quiet life where he had to face exhaustion that no one saw. Those years had no clear moment of collapse, only a slow erosion, where each passing game was another step, taking him further from the person who once played baseball for hope and closer to a person who only knew how to play baseball, to avoid being replaced. The years after the pinnacle were not just Sammy Sosa's personal story, but a broader picture of an era that consumed the very heroes it created. A time when MLB walked in a gray area of rules, where the line between allowed and forbidden blurred to the point of almost non-existence. The league needed numbers to revive itself, needed long hits to fill the stands, needed symbols to tell a new story to America. But it failed to build clear ethical boundaries to protect the people carrying that story. The culture of don't ask, don't tell seeped everywhere from locker rooms to meeting rooms, From newspaper articles to ever-swelling advertising contracts, everyone knew something was off, but no one truly wanted to be the first to speak up, because silence at that time benefited too many sides. The media needed shocking headlines, record numbers to sell papers and attract viewers. Teams needed revenue and wins. Sponsors needed heroic images to attach brands to. And players, at the center of that whirlwind, had to face a stark reality. If they could not meet expectations, they would be replaced, forgotten, left behind. In that context, steroids did not appear as a coldly calculated plot, but as a whispered survival tool, a solution the system tacitly accepted to keep the machine running. For Sammy, who had grown accustomed to living in fear of being discarded since childhood, this pressure did not take the form of free choice. It felt like a narrowing path, where every slowed step could make him fall into the abyss. He looked around and saw bodies growing ever stronger, numbers climbing ever higher, praise given to power and endurance beyond human limits, and in silence, he understood that if he did not keep up, the story would continue without him. That era did not create lone villains. It created an atmosphere where fatigue was seen as weakness, where asking questions was viewed as sabotage, and where heroes were encouraged to push beyond their own limits for the greater good. Financial pressure also grew in an irreversible way. Bigger contracts, higher expectations, and with them the responsibility to support not just himself, but family, community, homeland. Every hit by Sammy represented not just him, but a promise to those who had placed faith in his image. In that world, steroids were spoken of in vague terms, not as guilt, but as part of the new standard, something that helped the body withstand the inhuman pace set by the schedule and expectations. The tragedy lay in the fact that the era never acknowledged its own responsibility when things began to crack. When questions were finally asked, the spotlight shone directly on individuals, ignoring the context that had nurtured silence for years. For Sammy, that meant bearing the judgment of a system that had once profited from the very things it now condemned. He became a controversial symbol, while the power structures behind the scenes maintained a safe distance. The era consumed heroes by first lifting them as high as possible, then, when a moral answer was needed, pushing them down as examples. Sammy continued living his double life amid that backdrop. On the outside, he remained the image of strength the public knew, still stepping onto the field with a smile and confidence. On the inside, he clearly felt himself being pulled into a machine that allowed no stopping, no admitting fatigue, and no turning back. The steroid era, in the end, was a collective tragedy, where responsibility was diffused to the point that no one truly took it, and where specific people had to pay the price for the profitable ambiguity of an entire system. Sammy Sosa did not walk through that era as a schemer, but as someone trying to survive in an environment where survival meant not being allowed to fall behind. And when the wave of judgment finally crashed down, it did not just sweep away reputation, but blurred the line between the man and the symbol, leaving a painful question that era never satisfactorily answered: who was truly protected and who was sacrificed to keep the miracle going a little longer. When the 2003 report was finally exposed to the public, it did not come like an explosion, but like a door opening slowly, long enough for every gaze to turn in the same direction, and cold enough that no one wanted to ask about the context behind it anymore. The dry lines of text, the listed names, and among them Sammy Sosa, the man who just a few years earlier had been hailed as the savior of American baseball. The media changed its tone almost immediately, quickly and decisively, as if performing a familiar ritual. The same crowd that once cheered now became the jury. The same stadium that once erupted in joy now echoed with whispers of doubt. Sammy went from beloved hero to controversial symbol, a name mentioned no longer with pride, but with a question mark. The stories that once praised his will and journey overcoming adversity were replaced by moral analyses, comparison charts, endless television debates. No one spoke of the summer of 1998 as a healing moment for the sport anymore. People began to talk about it as a suspicious miracle, a memory that needed re-examination. In the midst of that storm, Sammy chose silence. No long press conferences, no fierce defenses, no image protection campaigns, only a gradual withdrawal, as if he understood that any words now would be twisted, interpreted in the most unfavorable way. But that very silence became an implicit verdict, because in a culture that always demands clear confession, silence is seen as evasion, as admission, as a sign of unspoken guilt. Sammy realized he was facing a painful paradox. Speaking up could make things worse, but staying silent was taken as guilt. He was pulled into an informal trial where the rules changed constantly, where the context of an entire era was reduced to a simple question of right and wrong, and where the human being behind the symbol was no longer of interest. New articles appeared with cold tones. Sports shows discussed his legacy as if he already belonged to the past, even though he was still alive, still breathing, still feeling every judgmental word fall. Sammy understood that the crowd did not really want to hear his complicated story. They wanted a neat answer, a template to end their own discomfort, and when he did not provide it, they created the story for him. In those days, Sammy's double life became more painful than ever. On the outside, he was the subject of controversy, the example dissected, the symbol of a doubted era. On the inside, he was a tired man, carrying both sacrifices and mistakes, trying to hold on to the private part of his life before it too was invaded. The silence he chose was not arrogance or defiance, but a survival reflex, like what he had learned as a child. When the world becomes too dangerous, it is better to curl up so as not to be crushed. But the world did not see that. They saw an emptiness and filled it with suspicion. With each passing day, Sammy clearly felt that the love once given to him had distorted not into fierce hatred, but into cold distance. No more applause, no more goodwill curiosity, only debates about whether he deserved to be remembered. The most painful part of this period was not the public criticism, but the feeling of being stripped of the right to explain in a story he had helped create. Sammy Sosa, the man who once brought joy to millions, now stood quietly before the wave of judgment from that very crowd, understanding that from this moment his life would no longer be told in the old way, and the silence, which had once helped him survive, now became the evidence others used to conclude about him, closing a chapter where he was no longer seen as a human being, but as a problem to be resolved and done with. The night Sammy Sosa left Chicago was not a staged moment. No spotlights, no tribute video, no thank you speech echoing from the stadium speakers, but a departure so quiet it felt cruel, as if the entire city had decided to turn away at the same time. There was no farewell ceremony at Wrigley Field, no montage replaying the summer of 1998, no pause to acknowledge that this man had once carried the whole city on his shoulders. Sammy left the Cubs not to booze, but to silence, a silence more painful than any criticism, because it said the story was over without needing an explanation. A legend walked away like a stranger, like someone who had passed through but never truly belonged here. In those final days, no one came to ask how he felt. No one stepped up to say that despite the controversies, what he had done for the team and for this city could not be erased. Doors that had once been wide open now closed coldly, and Sammy understood that this turning away came not just from management or the media, but from the very atmosphere that had changed, where people wanted to move forward without carrying complicated memories. The greatest pain was not in having to leave the Cubs, but in the way he was allowed to leave, without a trace, without goodbye, as if the entire youth he had dedicated to Chicago was just an inconvenient chapter people wanted to turn past quickly. Sammy remembered the early years here, the evenings when Wrigley Field shook with every hit, the homeland flags waving, the kids wearing number 21 jerseys and believing he was invincible. All of that was now not mentioned, not placed beside his name in the moment of parting. It was a quiet but thorough denial, making him realize that this city's love had always been conditional. And when those conditions were no longer fully met, memories became easy to erase. In his private room, while packing the last belongings, Sammy faced an emptiness hard to describe, not from losing a team, but from losing a part of his identity he had built over many years. He had not just played baseball for the Cubs. He had lived for the Cubs, tied his name to this city, believed that amid all the controversies, there still existed a bond that could not be broken. But that night, the bond dissolved without a sound, leaving a man standing between two worlds, no longer called a hero, not yet ready to accept himself as someone abandoned. Sammy's double life reached its most painful point here. On the outside, he was spoken of as a closed chapter, a controversial symbol the Cubs wanted to move past. On the inside, he carried the deep wound of someone turned away by the very place he had given his entire youth to. There was no cathartic moment, no final words for release, only prolonged quiet, where he understood that from now on, his story with Chicago would be retold without his presence needed. The night Chicago let him walk away was not a loud event, but it etched into Sammy's mind like a cold cut, because it confirmed what he had feared since childhood, that his value could disappear as quickly as it had been given. And while the city moved on to a new chapter, Sammy left carrying both the glory and the pain, understanding that some losses cannot be measured by numbers or titles, only felt through the heavy silence of a night when no one said goodbye. After the night Chicago let him walk away in silence, Sammy Sosa did not seek a new stage, nor did he try to reclaim his voice in the public eye. He chose to return to the Dominican Republic, as if going back to the only place that still understood a person is not just the sum of numbers. There, amid the familiar Caribbean sun and wind, family became his final fortress, a closed space where he could breathe without defending himself against every gaze. The gates closed not to flee, but to protect the private life that was more fragile than ever. Sammy avoided the media, declined interviews, did not appear on debate shows, because he understood that any words could be distorted, and his presence now would only deepen the wound. In his own home, he became a husband, a father, a son, roles that needed no audience and demanded no perfection. Family, with simple meals, unrecorded conversations, evenings without flashbulbs, helped him relearn the most basic thing, existing without having to prove anything. But even in withdrawal, Sammy's life was far from peaceful. The double life simply reversed. It did not disappear. On the outside, the public continued to condemn. Articles and comments still mentioned his name as a controversial symbol, as an example to close a complicated era. On the inside, he tried to survive, tried to keep his family from being pulled into the storm of judgment centered on him. He learned to live slowly, but the unease did not vanish immediately. It crept into sleepless nights, into moments wondering if silence was the right choice. Avoiding the media did not mean avoiding memories. Every time he turned on the TV or scrolled past a headline, he clearly felt the distance between the image people debated and the man sitting quietly in his own home. Sammy no longer controlled the story about himself, and losing that control was as painful as any accusation. Yet, in that very seclusion, he began rebuilding a different kind of strength. Not flashy, not measured by home runs or titles, but by the ability to stand firm when no longer cheered. Family became the center of every decision, the reason he woke up each morning, and the place he could set down the burden without fear of judgment. These years brought no public redemption, nor did they erase the controversies, but they gave Sammy something he had rarely had before: the right to be a human being without performing. In that private space, He learned to accept that some battles cannot be won with words or actions before a crowd, but can only be endured until the pain eases. The double life reversed completely. The public saw him through a lens of condemnation, while his private life was a quiet struggle to survive, to protect the relationships still intact, to not let judgment destroy the part of life he could still preserve. Sammy did not seek sympathy, nor did he try to rewrite history on his terms. He chose to quietly live on, because, after all the noise that had passed, survival was sometimes the only victory still possible. In that house, where there were no roars or stadium lights, Sammy Sosa faced the rawest version of himself, a man who had once stood at the pinnacle and now had to learn to live in the quiet, not to escape the world, but to hold on to the humanity that had not yet been swept away by the storm of fame and judgment. After withdrawing from the spotlight and tightly closing the door on his private life, Sammy Sosa's body became the last place the world still felt it had the right to invade, and also the place where he began his quietest but most painful battle. When photos emerged showing his skin had changed, the public's reaction was not curiosity or empathy, but mockery. Jokes, harsh comments spread quickly, turning his appearance into entertainment as if the person behind it no longer mattered. People asked what he had done to himself, why he looked that way, but few asked the reverse. What can someone judged for years do to escape the image the world has decided to hate? In that storm of sarcasm, Sammy chose silence again, not because he had no answer, but because he understood that any explanation would be twisted into new material for laughter. The nature of that change was not about aesthetics or shock, but something much deeper, a desire to erase the version of himself the public had decided to despise. When fame no longer protected him, the body became the final battlefield, where he could control at least one thing in a life that others had defined for too long. The psychological collapse did not happen in one moment, but built up over years of judgment, over every time he was named as the negative symbol of an entire era, over every time he was stripped of the right to be seen as a complex human being. Sammy's skin, face, external image became the surface where inner wounds tried to escape, a sign that he was attempting to break free from his own shadow, even if the price was merciless ridicule. The public saw the change and laughed, but did not see the long nights where he wondered how to keep living when everything that once brought pride now only evoked hatred. For Sammy, the body was no longer a tool for creating victories, but a place to place the fragile hope that if he changed enough, the world might stop talking about the old him. But the world did not stop. It latched onto that change as new evidence for the story it had chosen to tell. And so, the battle became even crueler, because every effort to escape unintentionally pulled him back to the center of judgment. In this period, Sammy's double life took a different form. On the outside, he was the target of jokes and suspicion, an image analyzed in every detail. On the inside, he was a man trying to keep his mind from completely falling apart. The body became the final battlefield, not because he wanted attention, but because it was the only place he still felt he had the right to decide. The change in appearance did not bring release, but it exposed the depth of the damage he had endured in silence. And while the world kept mocking, Sammy learned to endure once more, because throughout his life, he had grown used to his pain being misunderstood. Here, the tragedy was not in the changed skin color, but in the fact that a human being had been pushed to the point of feeling the need to alter his own body to escape others' hatred. That was the moment when wins or losses on the field no longer mattered. All that remained was a man facing the mirror, trying to recognize who he was, after every label had been stuck on and torn off too many times. Sammy Sosa's apology came late, so late that when it was finally spoken, almost no one was truly waiting for it anymore. There was no packed room of reporters, no carefully staged press conference, no iconic moment for history to remember. Just a few words uttered after years of silence, in a context where the story about him had almost been fully framed. For those who had turned away, the apology was not clear enough. For those who had once defended him, it arrived too late to make a difference. And for most of the public, it merely passed by like a minor detail in the news stream, already accustomed to mentioning Sammy Sosa's name with suspicion. That apology did not save his reputation, did not bring him back to the center of the conversation, and did not erase the years of judgment. But its value lay not in the external reaction, but in the rare thing hidden behind each word. For the first time, Sammy allowed himself to admit that he had been hurt. Not hurt from a single misunderstanding, but from an entire long journey where he was swept into the machinery of expectations, of the system, of choices that sometimes were no longer free choices. That apology did not carry a tone of self-defense, nor did it try to explain right and wrong in detail. It was vague, cautious, as if the speaker had grown too used to any words being interpreted in the most unfavorable way. That very vagueness disappointed many, because they expected a clear confession, a complete story to close their own discomfort. But for Sammy, speaking out was already a difficult step, because throughout his life, he had learned to stay silent to survive. That late apology was not an effort to please the crowd, but a rare moment when he turned inward to face himself, admitting that the years had left deeper wounds than he had ever dared say. In that instant, Sammy no longer stood before the public as a controversial symbol or a forgotten legend, but as an aging, weary man carrying mistakes, sacrifices, and pains that cannot be measured by statistics. The lukewarm public reaction only highlighted the tragedy further. The apology no longer had the power to change a story that had already been told to completion. But it carried a different, quieter meaning, because for the first time, Sammy allowed himself to say that what had happened was not just an issue of image or legacy, but personal wounds lasting many years. No one applauded, no one celebrated, and perhaps no one truly listened fully. Yet for him, that apology marked a small inner release, where he no longer had to force himself to play the strong role before the world. It did not save his reputation, but it allowed him to acknowledge that he too was a victim of an era that pushed people beyond limits. And in the public's indifference, Sammy understood that this apology was not for them. It was for himself, as a way to accept that the pain was real, that the silence over the years was not because he felt nothing, but because he felt too much. This was not the end of the controversy, nor a redemption granted, but a fragile moment where a man who had lived his whole life in the role of a symbol allowed himself to admit vulnerability, even knowing it might not change anything on the outside. Sammy Sosa's legacy has entered a trial with no end date, where the numbers stand face to face with morality, and neither side is willing to back down. 609 home runs, 3 seasons surpassing 60. The years that pulled fans back to the ballparks after American baseball's crisis, all of it still sits there, clear, impossible to erase from the stat sheets. But at the same time, another question hangs over every conversation. How are those numbers viewed when the ethical context of an entire era is re-examined under today's standards? The Hall of Fame continues its silence, not with an outright rejection, but with prolonged delay, year after year, as if silence could resolve the discomfort. With every ballot not cast, the story is told in 2 opposing directions. One side speaks of historical fairness, the other of moral responsibility. In the middle is a human being stuck in limbo, where legacy is neither framed nor closed. That suspension is not just about honor. It is a prolonged state of living, where every mention of Sammy Sosa's name must come with an invisible asterisk. People debate whether legacy can be separated from context, whether an individual should bear the full moral burden of a system that once profited from the very things now condemned. In sports shows, editorials, the numbers are placed next to heavy words, and conclusions are rarely unified. The pain does not lie in being debated, that is unavoidable, but in having a lifetime's legacy held in suspension, not allowed to settle in collective memory. Sammy lives with the feeling that his past is always in the present tense, always pulled out for retrial, while many others have been allowed to move on. The Hall of Fame, with its silence, becomes a symbol of history's hesitation, unwilling to fully accept, also unwilling to decisively reject. And in that hesitation, a larger question gradually emerges: whether history leaves room for human complexity. Because if history only accepts neat stories, where right and wrong are clearly divided, then gray eras will always need scapegoats to cleanse memory. But if history dares to look straight at the truth that people exist within systems, under the pressures of their time, and make choices that are never perfect, then legacy can be understood in a broader, more humane way. For Sammy, that question is no longer academic. It is tied to honor, to how his grandchildren will read his name in history books, to whether the moments that saved the sport itself will be remembered without disdain. The suspension of legacy is a prolonged punishment, because it allows no closure, no healing. With each voting season that passes, each time his name is mentioned and then passed over, it reminds him that his story has not yet been decided by history. But right in that state, another truth also emerges. Legacy is not decided only by voting rooms. It lives in the memories of those who witnessed it, in the emotions of summers gone by, in the inspiration that a boy from San Pedro de Macorís brought to millions of others. Official history may stay silent, but living history never completely stops telling. And perhaps the most painful question is not whether Sammy Sosa will be honored, but whether we have enough courage to let history contain human complexity, to acknowledge that a life can be both brilliant and wounded, both contributory and flawed, and that fully understanding that is far harder than delivering a neat verdict. When Sammy Sosa's story comes to a close, it does not take the shape of redemption, nor is there a moment of full vindication to soothe all controversies. There is no grand ceremony, no bronze plaque engraved with his name in absolute consensus, no unified forgiveness handed out. What remains is only time, quiet and persistent, passing beside a man who has grown old with his own memories. Sammy lived the final years of his career not as a worshipped legend, but as a human being who had to learn how to exist when the crowd had walked away. He lived with his family in a slow rhythm, where mornings no longer had packed training schedules, where evenings no longer had roars from the stands, and where fame was no longer the center of every conversation. There, he carried both glory and shame, neither erased, neither placed higher than the other, because both were inseparable parts of a life lived too long under the lights. Not being fully honored does not mean everything he did is denied, but not being fully forgiven means the wounds of that era still linger, smoldering in collective memory. Sammy understood this better than anyone. He did not wait for history to suddenly change its tone, nor did he expect a final verdict that would satisfy everyone. What he learned, through years in limbo, was how to keep living when his own story was no longer under his control. He cared for his family, nurtured quiet but lasting relationships, and sought peace in simple things that the pinnacle had never allowed. There were days when memories returned like a headwind, carrying images of shaking stands, dazzling numbers, and cold headlines. But there were also days when he was just a man sitting quietly, realizing he had survived what not everyone survives, the crowd turning away. That survival did not look heroic, had no applause, but it was a different kind of strength, silent and enduring. Sammy was no longer at the center of daily debate, but his legacy still existed in a complex state, both a source of inspiration and a reminder of the cost of collective expectations. He had learned to accept that his life would never be retold in a single voice, that there would always be those who only remembered the glory and those who only mentioned the controversy. Between those two poles was the real man, carrying choices shaped under the pressures of his era, mistakes that cannot be erased, and contributions that cannot be denied. This ending offers no verdict, because judgment itself had followed Sammy for years. Instead, it leaves a simpler image: an aging man living with his family, carrying memories heavy enough not to be forgotten, but deep enough to understand that fame is only a very small part of existence. And in the silence of those final years, a truth slowly emerged, not to justify, but to understand. The double life is not always deception. Sometimes, it is the price paid to survive in a world that only loves you when you win. The story of Sammy Sosa is not just the tragedy of a great athlete surrounded by controversy, but a painful reflection of how American society treats its heroes when they are no longer perfect. From the early pages, we see a boy born into poverty in San Pedro de Macorís, losing his father young, understanding very early that no one saves you but yourself. That fear of being left behind followed Sosa his whole life. From the early lonely years in America, labeled a muscular Latin player, to the summer of 1998, where he saved American baseball, but at the same time locked himself in an invisible prison of expectations. After 1998, every season was a survival test. He no longer played out of love, but out of fear of being replaced. When the steroid era was exposed, the same crowd that had cheered quickly became judges. Sosa chose silence to survive, but that very silence was interpreted as guilt. The peak of the pain was the night Chicago let him leave without tribute, a legend, walking away, like a stranger, and the years retreating to the Dominican Republic, where family became the final fortress amid the storm of judgment. Even his body became a target of mockery, showing the depth of psychological damage when a person tries to erase the image that is hated. The lesson for Americans here is very specific. Do not love people only when they win, and do not withdraw their humanity when they fall. History, if it only seeks moral cleanliness, will leave no room for the true complexity of human beings. The greatest honor for Sosa does not lie in full vindication, but in looking straight at both glory and shame, to learn how to treat more humanely those who have carried hope for us when they are at the top, and when they have to survive after the crowd. If you believe that stories of glory, mistakes, and survival like Sammy Sosa's deserve to be heard fully, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support us. Thank you for staying until the very end. See you in the next video, where we continue to explore great but deeply wounded fates behind the stadium lights.